The following is rated not safe for work. It contains strong language, adult situations, and lots of spoilers. Discretion is advised.
In the criminal justice system, cinematic-based offenses are considered especially heinous. The dedicated attorneys who investigate these villainous films are members of an elite squad known as the Reels of Justice. These are their stories.
Order, please, order. The Reels of Justice is now in session. Judge Maynard Bangs presiding. Your eyes for the Honourable Judge Bangs.
Be seated. Welcome to the Reels of Justice. Today we are hearing the case of The People vs. Superman 3, a 1983 superhero film that sees the Man of Steel turn to a life of evil after being exposed to a synthetic kryptonite manufactured by a computer genius. For those of you unfamiliar with our court proceedings, we are here to determine if this film is guilty of being a bad movie. As always in this courtroom, films are to be considered excellent until proven awful, and the burden of proof lies upon the prosecution to prove beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that this film is guilty. Mr. Dylan J. Schlender, you are representing the prosecution. You may present your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. I often opine about, I opine about everything, really.
Oh, yes.
But when it comes to bad movies, I always say we need to remake bad movies. We don't need remakes of RoboCop or Red Dawn. We need a remake of Superman 3. It is really one of the reasons I so loathe Superman Returns, actually, because Superman 3 had the bare bones of an idea that could have really worked. So in my case, I want to focus on the missed, though interesting opportunities. Times when this movie zigged when it should have zagged. This movie is ultimately suffocated by its own weight. It's a hefty runtime, conflicting tones. I had to bring that up. The fans were getting nervous. And ultimately, just an unsatisfying story, an unsatisfying exploration of the Man of Steel. So let us go up, and far away from Superman 3 and actually consider what we can do with Superman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. Appearing on behalf of the defense is Mr. Andy Slack. Please present your opening statement.
Oh, thank you, my lad. Bad movie? Bad tra-la-la? I do wonder at the grounds the prosecution feels to state that this is a bad movie. The picture is kept in focus with the appropriate use of lighting and blocking. The sound is well recorded, the special effects in keeping with the time. Essentially, on technical grounds, this is a well-made film. It made its budget back and then some, did very well. 14th most successful film that year. The prosecution, therefore, must make the case that this is a bad Superman movie. Bad in terms of presenting the icon to the screen. Now then, the defense will in fact claim that a real examination of who Superman is and what that pop culture icon is actually all about shows that this is not only a good movie, it's an important movie. This is a movie that brings forward the Superman mythos in ways that are vitally important, not only to Superman, but to comic book movies, to movies in general, to the blockbusters of the 80s to come, and to the entire edifice of pop culture we have today. Thank you very much.
Hey, well, shoot for the moon. You might land in the stars, Mr. Slack.
Well, actually, I think we're probably going to end up talking about a few of the same things. That was a very good opening statement.
Hey, we'll find out if I ever get to kick it off. Mr. Schlender, why don't you present your first exhibit?
I believe I will, Your Honor. Thank you. So, if you squint, you can kind of see what works in this movie. Robert Vaughn is just too good in anything he does. He's my second favorite cowboy in The Magnificent Seven. A shiny peso to anyone that can name my first favorite. Should not be a hard guess.
Liam Neeson.
That's right. So, a business tycoon villain sounds familiar. A supercomputer villain sounds familiar. This movie is at the cusp of some great Superman lore, but it fumbles in the execution. And here is why. Those elements, when they pertain to Superman, are decidedly serious. The play for comedy hurts these elements, including, but not limited to, the altered kryptonite, which is another great idea, something we do see in comics, but again, fumbled here for the sake of comedy.
I'm
So
afraid
I
I'm going
think-
to have to object.
Please,
to,
go ahead.
You state that the idea of mutated kryptonite is fumbled here. Let me take you back a couple of years before this film came out. The last time we saw an altered form of kryptonite used on Superman in the comics was, I believe, in about 1977, when Brainiac used a form of kryptonite to mutate Superman's abilities. This caused Superman to develop a third eye on the back of his head, which he disguised from the world by wearing a series of increasingly elaborate hats, before eventually using said third eye to laser beam Brainiac in the denouement. I would argue that, in fact, crazy kryptonite crap was far worse in the comics, and this is a toned down example of the trope.
Well,
Even
Mr.
if it is-
Schlender, what do you have to say about that, Brainiac?
Well, that's what but that's my point, though, is that altered kryptonite has not really worked, right? It wasn't well executed in the comics. It wasn't well executed in this, and I don't think we would see it well executed until we got to something like red kryptonite that made like Superman in a rage. I mean, and synthetic kryptonite has always been a slippery slope in Superman media, especially here, because we say like there's a missing element, and it's tar. Well, tar is not an element, right? So, and then how do they even know that kryptonite hurts Superman? And like they're pulling this all out of like, it's like the characters in this live in a world where Superman comics
Objection.
exist. Please.
They know very well that kryptonite hurts Superman. That was explained in the first two films. And we know that Lois Lane has been making extensive exposés on Superman's abilities. And we also know that
You're
someone with
postulating
Robert Bond's money
You're
and
postulating that
access
she wrote
would
it
be able
down?
to get that information.
I don't think so, because only Lex Luthor knew that it was kryptonite. And if you want to make the argument that Lois Lane wrote down Superman's only weakness in an expose, I'm not buying that, because that doesn't jive with anything we've seen in
But
any
Lex Luthor tried to
interpretation of
use the
Lois Lane.
kryptonite on Superman, and he only escaped through the actions of Miss Teschmacher, which were used by her as an exculpatory factor in getting her off from ending up in jail with him.
I'm going to sustain it. It seems like it's a weakness that characters in that universe are aware of.
Also, she does it to save her mother. That is the continuity.
That is true. However, it is an event that would have had to have come out in the court case that put Lex in prison.
I think it's pretty weak and not very well explained in the movie. And if you just
I
say
feel the judge may
kryptonite
not
hurts them,
take it
they
your
don't
way.
know. Well, that's what I'm saying. So let's say
I'm going to leave that one up to the jury.
in this hypothetical courtroom where they say kryptonite hurts them, they still don't know what the elements that make up kryptonite. But my point is that altered kryptonite, we really got off on a tangent, right? So let me just kind of continue here with the point. Superman can be lighthearted. I think Batman lends itself better to this, but Superman can get there too, but not with this lineup in this movie. The original script called for Dudley Moore as Mr. McYespitlick. And let's just take a collective moment to grieve that, because that would have been awesome.
That would have been amazing.
I know, right?
Well, I mean,
By
we did get Dudley Moore's off-time comic partner, Peter Cook, in the Supergirl film, and we saw how well that worked out.
Well, it wasn't Dudley Moore. By grafting these comedic elements onto the Lex Luthor analog and the Brainiac analog, it's reverse synergy. They hurt each other too much. We lose the comedy and we lose the heft and the gusto of those villains. So imagine the Superman of Superman 3 being asked if he should put the whole world in a bottle. Thud. Imagine him going toe-to-toe with a being from the fifth dimension played by Dudley Moore. Well, now we're getting somewhere. So that's the end of that point. Just tremendous missed opportunity, and the tones don't work.
I'm going to let Mr. Slack respond here about the tones and whether the comedy works in the film.
Well, I have a lot to say about the tone of the film, and I want you to remember that this is 1983. We're at the tail end of the Silver Age. So, in comic terms, this is the point in time where Superman is massively under the influence of the biggest pop culture event in comics that there had been for decades, which was the 1966 Batman serial. That was still the big thing that had influenced the view of Batman and therefore the view of Superman, who was his most common partner in comics. So the comics were campy, they were bright, the plots were ridiculous and stupid, way more stupid than people think they were. Superman had a different power every week. One time he had super basket weaving, and there was super cigar smoking. It was insane.
Oh, I want that one.
In terms of tone, this film is actually way more grounded than the comics are. They tone down a lot and make it far more believable and realistic. As unreal as it is, it's way more modern and realistic than anything that was happening in the comics at that time. So to a Superman fan, this was actually not excessive. This was, if anything, a lighter and more realistic look at Superman than a strict view of the comics would have been.
But I think
Mr.
you're.
Schlender?
It's an interesting equivocation because you're going from comic to movie. Let's go from movie to movie, shall we? Because we had Superman 1 and we had Superman 2. This is Superman 3.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that actually that dovetails into the next point that I was going to make, right? And I'll get to it in my own circuitous fashion. So,
Please proceed with your
as I said, with the
elocutions.
yeah. So with these conflicting tones, we have either what's an undercooked or overcooked, cooked, I should say. My goodness, though
You must be overcooked.
The cold medicine's real, man. So an undercooked or overcooked Richard Pryor, without exaggeration, Richard Pryor is one of the funniest men to ever live, to grace the silver screen. So we were expecting laughs, and they were played for, but juxtaposed to what? A drunk Superman having an existential crisis after being drugged, some horrifying robot lady. I mean, holy cow, that lady scared the
I will
crap
say
out
there's
of
a
me.
completely separate 1980s Richard Pryor movie going on here that I would have loved to see. About just a computer genius who ends up roped into a scheme. You can see that from beginning to end, and it's got Gene Wilder in it as the tycoon, and it would have been amazing. That would have
And
been
it would
good.
have been. And actually, I was going to talk about why this doesn't work because we had the ignominious exit of Richard Donner from Superman 2, and I would direct everyone to listen to episodes 28 and 29 of One Track Mind for more of this history. And the screenwriters, David Newman and Leslie Newman now, they had a completely unmolested vision, but they had all the stuff they were frustrated that Donner suppressed in the first two movies. They got to really explore it in the third one, and that's why this movie is such a mess. That's why there's entirely too much things going on because of all the stuff they were denied in the first one. So there was no so Richard Lester, the director, he wasn't able to temper the worst excesses of these screenwriters the way Richard Donner was. And that's why it does feel like you said that this is a Richard Pryor movie sandwiched into a Superman movie. That's why we have this really weird dark Superman fighting himself in the garage, yet flicking peanuts at a bar, you know? So it's what is actually going on? What is this movie really trying to say? And it turns out not much.
Richard Pryor, Richard Donner. Who's the third Richard?
Richard Lester,
I don't
the
know.
director.
Lester.
Richard
Richard
God, there's a
Lester,
lot
yes.
of dicks in this movie. Mr. Slack.
A lot or not enough. I will answer a lot of these points, but I'm going to have to ask you to remember a couple of dates. So,
Please.
first 1975, 1977, 1983, 1986, 1989. 1975, the Vietnam War finally comes to an end, and America is truly at a crossroads. The American psyche has been massively wounded and damaged. America doesn't really know what it stands for anymore. And The cinema responds to this at the end of the 70s with 1977's original Superman, an icon from the past in a film that's looking to the past, a film that references the 30s right there in the first few frames. This is the original Golden Age Superman writ large brought to life, but it's fundamentally a backwards looking film looking at American values, American way, etc. Then, of course, we have this film that comes out after those first two, which I count as one thing, really. Superman 3 comes out.
I'll stipulate that. You could count them pretty much as one movie,
Yeah,
sure.
essentially. Now we're in the 80s, and we're past Vietnam, but we're still not sure what the 80s is going to bring. This is going to be the age of the computer, of big business, of small-town America being ground underfoot by modern business titans. And again, America is unsure where we're going and what we're doing. And we have this film forward-looking. This is the film that brings Superman into the current day of the time and looks at who are the baddies going to be? Who is the enemy? Who is Superman going to fight? And, of course...
Richard Pryor.
Well, Superman doesn't fight Richard Pryor, but... Richard Pryor is the American everyman being ground underfoot by tech titans, as many of the
objection. He is not. Be. He's very complicit. I mean, he designs the super.
He's complicit, but he's a grifter. He's a criminal, and it's entirely unclear why he's a computer genius. But that's just pure luck.
I wish that was.
I'll sustain that. Pryor's not entirely victim, but he's not entirely bad guy either.
I mean, a lot is done to set him up as a sympathetic figure. He appears at the start in the unemployment.
I'll agree to that. He is sympathetic.
Yeah. He's literally going to starve unless he gets a job. But yes, he is tempted by the wild excesses of the decade.
Makes us all sympathetic 1980s. Characters.
Yes, but he learns his lesson. Fine. But this is a Superman for the time. It's not a Superman looking back. It's a Superman looking forward. He's fighting a business tycoon. He's fighting a computer. He's dealing with the things that America is worried about now. And the world took notice. 1986, 3 years after this film, DC Comics decides to reboot Superman. Superman is changed. The Golden Age is over. The Silver Age is over. The Bronze Age begins. Superman now has a much more restricted power set, a much more simplified origin story. Lex Luthor is no longer a mad scientist in a purple disco suit and is changed to be what? A business tycoon who looks like Robert Vaughn but bald. The themes and issues this film creates, the vision of Richard Lester, not only reflects the canon of the day, it becomes the canon of tomorrow. This changed what Superman would be 3 years later. They took everything that happened in this film and made it the truth of Superman. This film became what Superman is and guided what Superman would be.
Mr. Schlender, is Superman the man of tomorrow?
I'm very glad that he brought up this point about this movie kind of being a response to the 80s, because that's actually what my third point was really about. And when we talk about superhero movies, it does give a chance for filmmakers to make interesting commentary. This would be much more pronounced in Superman 4, with the strong anti-nuclear proliferation message. But here in Superman 3, which is what are we supposed to really take away to understand from it all? And it seems largely technophobic. I don't think it's really sounding alarm bells the way Andy, my esteemed counsel opponent here, would have us believe, because again, it's just suffocated by the conflicting tones, runtime, and things of that. So this could be a possible response to the Japanification that was all the rage in the 80s and ultimately typified in 89's Kenjite, the last Bronson Thompson joint, right? But that's the thing, though. This is not really a topic worthy of Superman. Now, is it? Because, like Andy was saying, he is the arbiter of truth, justice, and the American way. The weakness of the conflict of this story is simply not worthy of Superman's biblical gifts. Nothing in this story makes us wonder how a god behaves as a man, which is the core of almost every Superman story. Superman's, superness has a lot to do with how he reacts when his tremendous powers are too dangerous. And we actually see this, even though it's a ridiculous scene, we see this in the first Superman movie where he literally has the ability to reverse time to save Lois Lane. So this movie has a completely insufficient exploration of Superman. And while there would be the crisis 3 years later, that's what the event's called in the comics, the Crisis on Infinite Earths,
Crisis,
where it realigns all the canon. And yes, we do see Luthor as businessman, which is probably a bit of a nod to the Robert Vaughn character, though Robert Vaughn is still very silly in this. Brainiac is not all that different now that he's an AI supercomputer. It's still a lot of the same ideas. And that's where this movie really falls short. It was getting close to what Superman would ultimately become, but it wasn't able to make it, and it ended up suffering greatly because of that. So we don't get a clear message. And then looking at the Crisis 3 years later, it's like, okay, that's pretty interesting. But ultimately, Superman 3 fell short. And that's why, unfortunately, it's bad. Even though it has some of these neat ideas that it tried to propagate, it just wasn't able to deliver. And on that, I will rest your honor.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Slack, you may present your first exhibit.
All right. My first exhibit, of course, is the film itself and the era that it's in. Let's have a look at Superman 3 and what came after it. Because, as my esteemed colleague has said, maybe this film fell a little short in its ambitions. But should man's reach not exceed his grasp? I'm arguing that this is a foundation stone and not the finished building. This film comes out at a time when sequels really weren't a thing in Hollywood the way they are now. You would have a film, if it's a blockbuster, that's great. We all want another Jaws. We all want another Star Wars. The attitude would be that if it's good, let's make maybe one more as a bit of a cash grab and then move on. Franchises didn't exist. You had James Bond, but there was no continuity between films. Star Wars was still only on its first sequel. Jaws was the original big blockbuster, just about getting a sequel, but Hollywood hadn't picked up on the idea that you could keep going with an idea. Now Superman 3 comes along because 1 and 2 had made enough money to justify it, and it did well. People think it was a flop, but it wasn't. As I say, this was the 14th biggest film of its year, and this is at a time when big films were big in the money terms of the day. It doubled its money. It justified yet another sequel, and that was unheard of at the time. And what happened afterwards? The studios realized there was good stuff in comics, in these iconic figures. They wanted more. They started looking beyond Superman. Other ideas started to float about. And then that last date I asked you to remember, 1989, they got their next big thing after Superman. What did they do? Batman, the movie. And that, of course, spawned everything that came after. You get the DC universe, the animated universe, the Justice League animated series, which was amazing, the Batman animated series, the Superman animated series. Eventually, this gives rise, quite literally, to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As I say, this is the foundation piece, not the finished edifice. What happened as a result of this film proving that there was life in Superman moving forwards, not just looking backwards, that there was a progression to be seen in Superman, which brought the comics forwards, led directly and consequently to all of the pop culture we see and enjoy today. That would be my first piece of evidence. I mean, I'm waiting for an objection.
Mr. Schlender, I'd like to let you have time. Mr. Slack would argue that if we go back in time and kill Superman 3, we won't have to sit through the MCU.
Yeah. Oh God, if only. But here, okay. Look, his extrapolating from Superman 3 getting us all the way to where we are today. Now, talk about reach exceeding your grasp. Because I think more of that credit does belong to Tim Burton's Batman, which does not borrow a single drop from Superman 3.
But would it have been given the chance in the first place if Superman hadn't paved the way?
It would have, but Superman 1 and 2 definitely paved the way, and then Superman 4 was ultimately a flop before. So there, you're right. It wasn't a financial flop, but critically, it was incredibly poorly received by fans and movie critics alike for a lot of the reasons I've already outlined and you've conceded. There was just too much going on. So I appreciate where you want to take this, but I don't think the jury's going to buy it. I don't think there's enough meat on Superman 3 to say this paved the way for comics and the animated series and everything.
Well, we do know
a
that
lot more credit goes to Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, if you want to play that game.
We do know that the comic incarnation of Superman directly drew from the films, because the impression that Christopher Reeve made absolutely affected the comics. It affected the look of Superman and how he spoke and how he behaved on the comics page. And we also know that a scant 2-3 years after this film, many of the ideas directly in this film specifically became rooted in the Superman comic. So
and that's all interesting, but it can still be a bad movie that's making these ripple effects. If you throw a rock into a pond, the pond doesn't care if the rock's good or bad, right? But this is a bad movie that's having these ripple effects, right?
Well, you can take your medicine without enjoying it. That doesn't mean it isn't good for you.
But it's not a good movie.
I can't understand all these metaphors. No more metaphors, please.
I'm sorry. My point is this movie, because I am interested in some of these ripple effects. I'm a big fan of Superman's canon and his history. I really am. And I do think Superman 3 has a place in it, but we do need it in its proper context. We do need to understand that even if we want to give it a lot of credit for these, and we can give it some, I'm fine doing that, we still need to understand that it's a poorly made and poorly constructed movie, that they were able to mine a couple interesting ideas that would eventually become good. Luther being
all right, I'm gonna pass it back to Mr. Slack here.
Yeah, that's fine. That's why I wasn't objecting. I'll just keep going.
I would certainly take issue with the idea of poorly made. Now, today, to our eyes, sure, a lot of the effects look pretty hokey, but at least some of those effects, specifically, weirdly, the awful Atari-style computer games section at the end, that was that was at the time the most sophisticated piece of computer animation that had ever been done. They actually had to do that frame by frame and photograph each frame one at a time. It was incredibly difficult, and at the time, that was the sort of computerized effects that were impossible to do. They had to work out how to do it. And similarly, a lot of the special effects that used very massive models, massive sets that still look gorgeous. Really, if you take a look at them, they weren't badly made. Now, you may take issue with what they were doing, but it was done in a way that was good and was done certainly in line with the standards of the time and what was possible at the time, and in places beyond what had been possible at the time. So I'd absolutely take issue with poorly made. It was not.
Well, I want to object, because I think if we looked at Superman 3, the picture book, you would have a point. Like, that's a cool evil lair. That's cool Atari graphics. But we actually have to watch the film that's happening. They built this supercomputer based on napkin sketches. That's ridiculous. Microchips take forever to make. You can't help but watch this movie and think, like, where is all this technology coming from?
Objection to that.
He's trying to shoot missiles at Superman on the video game. It's like, this is just so silly.
This is 1983. Nobody knew what computers were yet. Hollywood had no idea what they could do. They just had a vague idea that they were box-shaped and magical. That's completely in line with everything else everyone else was doing at the time.
No, but that ties back to the technophobia point, which is not really a staple of Superman really moving forward at all. So it's a weird storyline for Superman to have. If you're just talking, if your argument is we have to exploit the ignorance of the 83 audience for not understanding what supercomputers are, that's not really a Superman kind of story. And then
I'm going to let Mr. Slack respond to that.
I would certainly argue that this isn't a technophobic film. Now,
I believe it is.
You have a new kind of you have a new kind of threat. Yes, you have the business tycoon as threat, and his plot is surprisingly sophisticated. His execution isn't, but his plot is take control of all coffee plantations across the world, and later all oil shipping, not production but shipping. That's actually genius. That's a really good way of making a hell of a lot of money, and no one can stop you doing it. So he does have a sophisticated plot, and he has a sophisticated means of doing it. He's using technology, but Superman stops this with the aid of knowledge he gains from the chemical plant scientist who tells him about the acid that explodes when it gets super hot. He effectively uses technical means against a technical enemy and uses his brains to outthink the computer rather than to outfight it. That's far more of a sophisticated Superman than just the lifting things up that are very heavy we would see later in Superman Returns, which is all he does.
Well, if we're going to talk about, too, Superman using his brains, not necessarily something he's always been known for, and why not just dump the acid? Why do you have to there's a few plot points that are just so ridiculous it's barely worth addressing. But getting back to the technophobia part, also, let's not give Robert Vaughn's villain too much credit here. We've seen villains in past movies manipulate supply to get money. I mean, gold, that's the whole point of Goldfinger, right? He's not stealing the gold, he's irradiating it so his gold goes up. Like that's the whole point. You deter the shipping so the oil you already have goes up. I mean, so this is like, it's sophisticated in so much as, yes, it would take a lot of work to do this, but it's not original.
All right, Mr. Slack, would you like to present your next exhibit?
My next exhibit speaks to character. Now, we've already discussed Lex Luthor, and I do want to make him as a concept an exhibit, because before this film, we had the wonderful Gene Hackman playing Lex Luthor, and everyone loves Gene. He's an amazing actor. He was definitely playing the Silver Age Lex Luthor, though. So Lex Luthor was a crazy super scientist. He was bald because of a lab experiment he blames Superboy for, or something like that. It's mental. Most of his plots are basically holdovers from sort of World War II era crazy super science and UFOs and stuff. The Lex Luthor in the comics was basically a gibbering lunatic, a super scientist. This film created the image that would be Lex Luthor, Superman's greatest enemy, because Robert Vaughn, for all of the flaws of the character, is great, and his super smooth tuxedo-wearing business tycoon would absolutely become the model of Lex Luthor moving forwards after this film. As I say, 3 years after this film, they looked back and they said, what works, what doesn't work in the films, and that's one of the things they took. This film created who we think of as Lex Luthor, and that alone, again, it's the foundation stone. It's the reason why this film matters and is important. It's not the finished edifice, but this is the beginning, and it can't be taken away. You can't separate out this film and have everything be just as it was, because it's too fundamental to do that.
I got to object, though, because part of the reason they made Lex Luthor a business villain, too, was because you can't just have Superman go in and, like you said, pick up heavy things and smash things. So they made a Lex Luthor that wasn't so explicitly a supervillain, so he would be operating within the confines of the law, which would hamstring Superman's commitment to truth, justice, and the American way, because Lex Luthor's not technically doing anything illegal all the time, running his businesses. Whereas Robert Vaughn's character, clearly doing things illegal the entire time. He has that ridiculous he goes undercover with his sister, so like they try to inject this silliness into the Vaughn character.
Yeah, that
clearly
silliness
don't
is
see.
Pure old school Lex Luthor.
Yeah,
that's
and
exactly the kind of thing you used to see Lex Luthor
yes,
doing.
but you don't see that in the reimagining of Luthor. So again, I don't mind giving a smidge of credit for mining this interesting little nugget out of Superman 3.
May the court record that smidge.
The smidge is so noted, but
the smidge is noted.
But Mr. Slag, a few times the prosecution has brought up this silliness and this comedy that doesn't work. Would you like to respond to those points?
I would. Let's talk about silliness. We've had a lot of silliness in the previous films, to be honest. You've got the whole ripping the S off the chest and it turns into a big plastic thing to wrap up Non. That's insane. What the hell was that? Kneel before Zod. Awesome but silly. And you've basically got, it's true, you've got a lot of silliness happening. In this film, yes, there is a fair bit of silliness happening. Richard Lester produced those films in the 60s for the Beatles. He was quite a zany guy. But you also have Superman making a sturdy relationship with a single mother, looking to make her way in the big city and unsure if she can escape a possibly abusive relationship. You have Richard Pryor dealing with unemployment and his coming starvation. His only friend in life is his yo-yo, a cunning little allusion to African-American vernacular. You have
Damn.
Robert Vaughn, the smooth business villain of the 80s, the threat to come in the future that people were starting to get worried about. And basically, this film, for all of its silliness that is in there, actually deals with a lot of things that aren't silly. Alcoholic evil Superman, duality of self, warring against self and nature, the roboticization of that woman, which is absolutely freaky and gave me nightmares.
Same here, brother. Oh my god.
There is silliness, but there's a hell of a lot about this film that is very grounded and is very not silly.
But those clash. They each undermine each other. So it makes the silliness not so much fun, and it makes the serious stuff not so thought-provoking.
And in popcorn cinema, do we not have the sweet and the salty?
You can't then call it popcorn cinema if you want us to take these things seriously. You can't have it both ways.
It's a transitional film. It's a film.
Transitional film, Your Honor.
It's 2024. I'm going to allow the transitional film.
You know what?
It's a film that's in transition between two ideas of a pop culture icon. It's got one foot in the past and one foot in the future. And without this bridge, you can't move forwards. This film is necessary.
If you have 1 foot on a bridge and 1 foot off a bridge, you're falling off the bridge.
That's is true. Mr. Slack, would you like to rest on that, or would you have any final exhibits you'd like to present?
Well, I think I'm ready to make my final statement whenever you're ready.
Very good. Both sides have rested. Mr. Schlender, please present your closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Like I said, I really think Superman 3 could be remade, and it could be incredibly well executed. I do think it had the elements. I do think it had the ideas. And we do see some of those things play forward. How much credit we can give Superman 3, I'm not at liberty to say. However, if you want to give it maximal credit or minimal credit, you could still do it in the context of it being a bad movie. And that's what we're doing here today. The actual movie we're watching on the screen, it's a jumbled mess. It's overly long. Richard Pryor is very confusing and not as funny as we were hoping. He actually thought this would be a transition into serious films. Poor guy. Robert Vaughn is eulogianous, but also kind of silly, redolent of the Gene Hackman performances we had seen before. So we watch this movie either as the third one, so if you did 1, 2, 3 right into it, or if you watch it standalone, these are all going to be very glaring deficiencies to the discerning viewer. And again, we're looking at a story that is just beneath Superman's abilities, beneath his powers, and clearly wasn't even worth Lois Lane's time as she dips out of the movie right away. We should have all have been so lucky. And I will rest there. Thank you, Your Honor. Well, not rest, but that's my closing statement.
Thank you. Mr. Slack, please present your closing argument.
Well, my lord, this movie came about at a time when change was needed. The era of the 80s blockbuster was here, and audiences needed something new. Not to mention, comics needed something new. The gee-whiz or shucks campy nonsense that had been going on since the 60s had to go, and we needed to see what a Superman of the day looks like. Now, you might not like this movie, and seeing it in 2024, I can understand that. We're viewing it through different eyes than were viewed at the time. But don't forget just how much of what you do want to see in your pop culture started here, in this time, in this year, right here and now, and started with this movie. You may not love the movie, but you can't deny the significance of it and the place it holds in inspiring what came after. And so, in closing, I invite you, the jury, to join me beyond notions of art and trash, beyond good and evil, and bad and acceptable. Beyond morality, beyond man, lies Superman 3.
Thank you both. Members of the jury, Mr. Maynard Banks, Mr. Big Ben Haslar, and Mr. I hope you don't expect me to save you, because I don't do that anymore, Ryan Luis Rodriguez. You have all heard the facts concerning this case. It is now up to you to determine if this film is guilty of being a bad movie. The bailiff will escort you to the deliberation room to render your verdict.
Right this way. Do you suppose Superman needs to use the Super Bowl as his toilet? That's an old one. I think I've heard that one before.
Oh my god.
Ew.
Okay, guys, this was really interesting is the right word. Do you guys know how Richard Pryor ended up in this movie? Because I do.
They paid him in cocaine.
He was on the Tonight Show and was talking about, this is 1979. He was talking about how much he loved the first Superman movie, how he would run around his house with a towel tied around his throat as if it was a cape. And one of the producers said, well, clearly we got to get him in a Superman movie. And that's exactly how it happened. It
like
makes
that.
just as much sense as you think it would.
I need to just do
and I
more
wanna-
random gags to get jobs.
I mean, Richard Lester is actually a good director, but I think that he's ill-suited to be working on Superman movies. Like, the first 15 minutes of this movie are a Jacques Tati physical comedy spectacular in which the spectacular is garbage. And it's just people slipping around going, whoa, whoa, just a lot of that shit. And I fucking hate it. And then to speak to this point of groundbreaking computer graphics, supposedly, Wrath of Khan was made the year before and has an entire planet being terraformed via CGI and looks a million times better, and it cost literally a quarter as much. But I want to hear from Ben.
Well, that's interesting. I wasn't thinking about that. The computer graphics one is going to be one of my points. But yeah, this defense prosecutor, Andy Slack, man, he is on his A game. And one thing I look for in a defense prosecutor is like if there's an answer for everything thrown at them. And this guy had an answer for every single thing thrown at him. The one that reverberated the most with me is like just adding the context to things. Because I would see things like that Atari thing that you mentioned, but not really think like, well, at that time, what were computer graphics looking like? I wasn't thinking about Wrath of Khan in comparison to that, but like the age of computers, I was thinking like Technophobia. I wasn't thinking about, okay, this was kind of a dawning new transition. I mean, I knew that was like sort of a backdrop in my mind, but not quite like where this is something like we would be focused on like AI in the current sort of films that we'd be watching now, or why they're working so hard, the oil embargo, how much film this film actually did make. A lot of that sort of context makes more sense to me. So while I hate this film, and I absolutely agree with you about that opening sequence and almost everything about it, I hate it. That context makes it better. So I love it when a defense prosecutor can do that, where I'm hating a film and I still hate it, but I'm leaning towards letting it off.
Rob?
Well, I think a lot of how you view this movie is the context that you do view it in. And normally when I've seen this movie, it's because I was going through the Superman series. And if you watch Superman 1 and 2 and then follow it up with this, there is a pretty big clash in tones. But this time I just watched it totally standalone. And without that clash in tones, I just enjoyed it as a comedy. And the silliness was all supposed to be part of it. Now the defense kind of presented it as silliness being more of a glitch than a feature, kind of, or was kind of trying to do the 2-foot thing. But like, I don't see this film having any serious messages about anything at all. You know, like maybe it says a little bit about Clark Kent's character compared to Superman. But we didn't.
What about
hear
it being
too much
transitional
about
into like the way the new Superman comics would be written from that point on?
I think that's a retroactive look. I mean, in
That's a
hindsight,
stretch.
they took a few
For me, that's a
ideas
stretch.
later. Yeah, they took some ideas later,
Well,
but I wouldn't
Yeah,
say
but
that.
this film would deserve credit for that then, right? Because it did perpetuate that.
No, I think they're more influenced by Superman 4 than they are by Superman 3. Because Superman 4 had a moral to it.
The
It
worst
had
one?
a conscious center. And it's actually not as bad as Superman 3. That's the crazy thing. Part 4 is known as the worst one, but it's at least half a star better than Superman 3.
And
I
to me,
disagree with you there, sir.
Andy's convinced me that this film has a huge impact on Superman. He's convinced me it's incredibly influential in the lore of Superman. But he didn't necessarily convince me that, you know, the 90 or so minutes that I saw on screen really held together. Now, when I was watching it, I was enjoying it as a comedy, as its silliness. The silliness was the point. That's why it was Richard Pryor. But it was more argued that it had some serious stuff under it, and I don't see that at all. But Ben, what do you think? What would you say about this? How beholden is a film to the tone of its series?
Well, if this is because again, that One Track Mind, I think if you do listen to those 2 episodes, it kind of brought down those other 2 films a peg in my mind, with some of those crazy ideas that they had in there, like how people talk in space and stuff like that. It's amazing how sane those 2 movies ended up being. So you take some of those ideas going into this film, a lot of that kind of starts making sense to me. And in this film, like they actually managed to make that even like a more consistent tone, even though they have too much going on than what's going into it. So I think that makes sense given the transitional time and what they had to work with before, that they might want to try something different with it.
All right, let's start locking in. Ben, I know which way you're leaning, so go ahead.
Yeah, this guy might be one of my new top 10 favorite defenders. I'm afraid. I think I'm going to go not guilty.
Rob, I think I know how you're going too.
Well, he did really convince me on the legacy and the impact this has on the legacy of Superman. But, I wanted to hear more of a defense of the actual silliness going on the screen. And I thought he mentioning the Batman serial in the beginning as a big influence, that really worked for me. I wanted to hear that more. I didn't want to hear the silliness underplayed. I thought the whole point of this movie is that it intentionally went in a lighthearted direction, on purpose. So just as far as a
fortune teller to get your vote.
I'll just the argument that this would in hindsight change the direction of Superman doesn't necessarily make everything on the screen so conducive. So I'm going to leave this one in Ryan's hands. I'm going to go guilty.
Oh boy, you shouldn't have done that. I've made no bones about my feelings about Superman 3. If you care to learn, go to One Track Mind. That's been mentioned several times. I love you all. But this movie is
merits of the case, Ryan. Merits of the case.
This causes me harm, so I'm gonna go guilty.
Oh, I hate it because I like this movie. It's a great comedy. But it was not argued as a comedy today, so I couldn't.
Let's go tell that very handsome judge.
Very was in air quotes. I saw that.
Mr. Foreman. Excuse me, jurors. Have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor. In the case of The People vs. Superman 3, we find the defendant guilty of being a bad movie.
No.
The verdict is so rendered. I hereby ban Superman 3 to the Forbidden Zone. Is that what it's called, Schlender? What's the...
Phantom Zone?
The Phantom Zone. That's what I said. Yes. The mirror universe. And they're banging on it and they're screaming. It was at the end of 2. Court is adjourned.
Okay.
This is evil, Ben. I'm just slightly more of a jerk than normal, Ben. I think the Leaning Tower of Pisa would be better if it were straight. Isn't that weird? Wow. I'm reporting you outside the reels of justice. Mr. Andy Slack, you lost this case. You're looking a little scruffy, too. What'd you think of that verdict?
Well, I have to say I'm surprised to get that result, and I'm sure the appeals will go all the way to the movie Supreme Court. It may have been a loss, but it wasn't a complete loss, because I made them think, and I made people think about maybe watching this movie again with new eyes. Who knows? Maybe it'll be reappraised. But hey, if you like that, if you're a much maligned movie made mockery by the media, if you need the help of a charismatic stranger from a distant place with powers beyond those of normal men, maybe next time be an Andy Demander, because I'm ready to defend anything.
I think that's the first time we've had someone plug their lawyer services in the post-interview. I love it.
Mr. Dylan J. Schlender, you use too many big words. I hate you. What do you think of that verdict?
I gotta say, I'm a little surprised, but I love the case. This is a movie that I've had on that I thought would be a perfect fit for our for a trial. Andy made all the arguments I would have made defending it, because I do think there are a lot of neat things here. So every time he said something, it just delayed me, because I thought of that, and this is how I was going to respond to it. So if it did come out the other way, I really wouldn't have been disappointed. I usually not a fan of us rehabilitating too many movies, but I do think Superman 3 maybe deserves another look, because it is the one people tend to skip over. So definitely give it a shot. Make your own call. But I definitely want to say thanks to Andy for putting on such a good case. It was a lot of fun.
And this is Red Kryptonite Infected Ben signing off, realizing he's essentially grumbly but less adorable. Take it off, studio.
He wishes. But no, fascinating case, and yeah, I mean, I do like this movie. I do. It hurts to cast the vote, but I don't know that I can't vote for it not guilty as a serious movie.
Well, if I
way.
couldn't sway you, I'm glad I hurt you.
I love Andy. This is fantastic.
Yeah, no,
that is the problem, Maynard. The movie did want it both ways. It wanted to be funny and to kind of take a few things seriously. So your conclusion, I can't argue with. It's a perfectly fair conclusion.
Which is too bad, because I was just in stitches the whole time. I've seen it before and it didn't make me laugh, but then this time when I watched it, I was totally into, oh no, this is just silly. What I wanted to hear was something about Christopher Reeves didn't like the dark tone of the second and asked for it to be more kid friendly. Like I wanted to hear that. Like, this is what Reeves wanted.
No,
and
Reeves' favorite part.
Then really, then why did we make it so silly? Then it seems like it was no reason.
Yeah, because Reeves actually didn't like it being silly. His favorite part is the garbage fight, and he basically hated the rest of the movie. He said,
I like the garbage fight because
you can take the garbage fight out and just watch that on its own, and it's a lovely bit of Supermaning.
Yeah,
I would agree. Actually, I like it too.
Christopher Reeve, Margot Kidder hated the movie so much that she's not in it.
Well, yeah, exactly.
She's in the bookend scenes, but she hated the script.
Yeah.
She hated that Donner guy.
Donner. Yeah.
Just recast the character. Just make Pretty Lady Lois Lane now.
Well, no, bringing Lana Lang in was actually really smart, because that is from Superman's past. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff that works. It's an interesting movie.
I like Richard Pryor, though. I do like
Richard Pryor stuff. I love that he does the Superman chest thing. It's like, dude, you don't know that Clark Kent does that? What are you doing?
Anytime we can get any more Richard Pryor, that's a good thing. We didn't get enough of him. I agree. And, we got to treasure everything we did get.
I think it's the biggest strength of the film. Really, that's what, like that, and when Reeves is doing comedy, I think that's the strength of the film. But now, Andy, you seem to know a lot about comics. So what keeps you busy when you're not doing this?
Well, I make and draw them.
That'll be it.
Oh, sweet.
No, so I draw an incredibly obscure, super nerdy comedic take on the Dune series of novels that is so nerdy. I started with God Emperor that nobody has read. And
he's right.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work making comics and stuff just for fun, just for goofs. But some people like them. So
is it Dune?
Well, I've done other things as well, but for some reason people love the Dune stuff.
Okay, but it's not a parody of Dune. It's actually an adaptation.
It's very strictly in canon with David Lynch.
Nice. Oh, cool.
Ooh, with Lynch. Oh, even better.
Oh, yeah.
You've made a fan of Ryan. For sure.
Apparently.
Well,
the Lynch movie, don't you?
I don't like the movie, but I love Lynch. I
want to
love
look
the
up
aesthetic of the film. The aesthetic of the film is marvelous. Like, it looks so good.
I mean, if you want to look up any of my stuff, go on Facebook and just search Andy Slack Comics, and you'll find me there. And I'm very difficult to find on purpose. I don't want people to be able to find me without a fight.
How did Dylan get you then?
Well, too bad, sir, because I'm gonna find you.
If you prove yourself worthy, and you get past my Riddle Master, and you cross the chasm of doom, you might be able to see some of my work.
Well, we get you onto this podcast, so it can't be that hard. I know the numbskull who gets people on here, so it couldn't have been that much work.
It's like 100 Andy Slacks here on Facebook. How do I know which one to go towards?
His boss called me on the phone. That's how I got him on the show.
Oh, excellent.
Now, outside of what I do personally on my own, I'm also a member of the Cinemania Society, which is another podcast. We look at the strange, cultish, and weird in cinema and denounce everything that is mind-bendingly heretical and perverse in pop culture. You can Google Cinemania Society to check your podcaster of choice, or just go to thecinemaniasociety.podbean.com and see what we're up to.
All right, pop quiz hotshot. What are members of the Cinemania Society known as?
Well, We have an increasing roster of incredibly obscure titles that we give each other on an updated basis. We love big titles, and we love giving each other all sorts of elaborate jobs and roles. So don't even ask me to go through them all now. I'd have to
The answer
look.
is Cinemaniac. It's Cinemaniac. If you suffer from Cinemania.
Cinemaniacs are people suffering from Cinemania. We are the
Oh,
cultists
you just got lawyers.
preventing Cinemania.
You're preventing Cinemania. So you're anti-Cinemaniacs.
We're fighting against it. You know, the Cancer Society doesn't go around giving people cancer, does it?
Well,
we don't
he's got
know.
Cinemania.
We don't know. Something's keeping him business.
You don't call the fire department because you want someone to light your cigarette.
I like this guy, but there's too many metaphors.
They did it to deter the Soviets. Oh, I'm sorry.
But no, that's great. No, and yep, we are big fans of the Cinemania Society, and apparently there's a lot of you, and you have ninjas, or you stop ninjas.
We're currently being assaulted by various types of cinema assassins sent by our
now,
cult
Cine
head
Assassin
office
is awesome.
who want to eradicate our work because we've not been a very good cult. We've been getting up to some bad stuff, and they're trying to stop us. So yeah, we're having our problems, but we're going to get through it.
How do I join the Cine Assassins? Because that's awesome.
Well,
I think
usually you have to have
Wheels
a
of Justice.
terrible accent and some kind of a theme. It's kind of a The Warriors situation, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Well, I
the
do bang
Lizzies.
empty bottles together quite a lot.
I've got
now
the
we-
baseball bat. Maybe we could use that.
You could try. Now, we always ask for recommendations from our guests for movies that you think people should see. So, Andy, what is a movie you think people should see?
Well, if you're looking for a different take on superheroics, you could do worse than The Return of Captain Invincible with a young Alan Arkin and Christopher Lee. Imagine Superman as a broken down drunk coming out of retirement for one last adventure, and also it's a musical. It's pretty obscure. It's insane. Christopher Lee has his own track on it. It's brilliant. Look it up.
Is this Australian? If I remember,
I believe it was filmed in Australia, but
because it's
got
on Not
international.
Quite Hollywood, the documentary.
Yeah.
and I wanted to see it.
It's. I'm not going to say it's good, but it's worth a watch.
Yep, that's what we like. That's where our recommendations tend to land. Schlenzo, what have you got for us? Liam Neeson?
Oh, absolutely. So, as everyone knows, I'm trying to go through all the various hackers on Tubi, and I've settled into a comfortable rut with Liam Neeson movies, including The Commuter, which came out in 2018. And you see, Liam Neeson is an ex-cop turned insurance salesman, and get this, he's on a train of pain. He's recruited into a bizarre plot of intrigue that honestly it doesn't make any sense, but it does give him an excuse to beat people up. And did I mention Patrick Wilson's in it? Well, he is. Look, I'm not really sure if this is a good movie, and it's probably a bad movie. I'm not too sure.
No, it's surprisingly good.
You think it's
Ooh.
surprisingly good?
I
Okay.
think, given
That means it
what,
is.
Given the resources, it's surprisingly good.
Not
Oh, if
good,
it
but
was me-
surprisingly good.
If it was made cheap, but it does have that hacker quality that we like. You know, Neeson is a family man. He gets put into this impossible situation. He relies on his years of training to do the right thing, and it's ultimately pretty satisfying. You know, so I do.
And
think
this is all taking place on a train.
Years of training.
Correct.
One train.
You know, so again, it's streaming on Tubi. I think Neeson is the heir apparent to Bronson at this point. I'm
Stop
not
saying
quite,
that.
Yeah, but I'm not going to put my seal of approval on it just yet. But I really think we're getting there.
It's an incredibly specious theory based on almost nothing.
Yeah, it is. It's just based on whatever
Your next
movie I watch.
podcast is like,
Is it just going to be Liam Neeson arguing with the conductor over ticketing prices or something?
I'm getting off at the next stop, all right?
I bought a return ticket on this train. I'm going on this train. I'm getting off at Paddington Circular. I'm going to get a nice cup of tea and go home again. And you're going to let me.
Do you have a particular set of passes? Now, Schlenzo, how would you like if I recommended another Richard Pryor movie?
I would love it.
Well, how about one that's not a comedy?
I would be less enthused.
I think I know what this is.
I know you were saying in 83 he was trying to transition to a more serious film, but he actually already had one under his belt. This week I'm recommending 1977's Greased Lightning. Loosely based on the life story of the first ever black NASCAR driver, Wendell Scott, the film chronicles Scott's early career as a moonshine runner, as well as the obstacles he had to overcome to break into the industry at the height of segregation. I'm tempted to say it would make for a terrific feel-good movie for the whole family, because it's a very inspiring story. But the brazenly casual use of racial slurs by basically every single character in the film will sort of cancel that out. And they're not all friendly. A lot of hard R's in there. Some of them are friendly, though. But anyway, the film wrestles with the very important issue of race. Both kinds. And
Damn it. Shut it down.
And it does so sincerely, despite starring Pryor, Pam Grier, Beau Bridges for some reason, and Blazing Saddles' Cleavon Little. And it will be Cleavon! The film earnestly deals with the legacy of a man who persisted in the face of overwhelming prejudice. And although the film takes some creative liberties with that story, it's still a terrific feel-good movie for the whole family. Except for all that racism, which
Except
there's
for
a lot
racism,
of.
yeah.
Grease Lightning didn't appear to be streaming anywhere, so you'll have to rent or buy it. Is that the one you guessed, Ryan, or does he have another?
No, it's a different one. I was thinking Lost Highway, which he's really good in, but it's only like 2 scenes.
I thought it was like the Cotton
okay.
Club.
No,
or
so
something.
Pryor's the lead in this, then?
Yes, he's Wendell Scott, and
okay.
although he's like he's a little mischievous, especially when he's a moonshine runner. Like he's just kind of outsmarting the cops. He never really outwardly tells a joke, you know. Like
Oh wow,
Cleavon Little's kind of a little bit comic reliefy, but they're both still like fighting against like crazy racist sheriffs and a really like racist and bigoted NASCAR and all the fans there who want him to crash and all the drivers who
NASCAR
are
is bigoted? I don't believe it.
Well, back then, surprisingly, it's actually incredibly open-minded because they clearly let a black driver join like in the 50s when they didn't need to. They've backslid apparently, Ryan. That's the point.
It would be funny though if there was like a comparable like black racing league and he was like the Jackie.
There, yeah,
Robinson
there isn't exactly. There was no black NASCAR league at all. He wasn't breaking into that. So
I don't mean funny as in comedic. I just mean like if that was the
he went from moonshine running right into NASCAR and
nice,
and he does pretty good. So.
So I take it back. I am enthused. I kind of want to see this movie now.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty.
And a relatively young Bill Cobb. So, he's only like 50. Ryan, what have you got?
My recommendation this week concerns one of the greats, Italian master Roberto Rossellini, 1948's Germany Year Zero. The film follows a young boy who lives in Allied-occupied Berlin as he tries to live amongst depression, both physical, surrounded by bombed-out neighborhoods, and emotional, dealing with his crumbling family, falling prey to hard, reluctant decisions, hopelessly trying to work their way out of a bottomless hole. It's a profoundly stirring experience, staffed with locally sourced, often non-professional actors, further enhancing the sense of authenticity that Rossellini was known for, with his unique perspective on neo-realism. The film is the final installment of Rossellini's war trilogy, alongside Rome, Open City, and Paisan, and as much as I appreciate those films, this is the crowning achievement. Germany Year Zero is currently streaming on what used to be HBO Max.
Suck on that,
did
HBO Max.
Did you say it came out in 48 or 58?
48.
48. So like right after the war. That's incredible.
Interesting.
God, I can really tell who the beating comedy heart of this podcast is.
Oh man, can we keep?
It's
Andy?
not going to be me. Yeah, you want on, Andy? I'll leave, and you can take my place.
We are going to feel so bad when those Sin Assassins kill Andy.
Oh no!
I will be very sad.
He's the one we're going to miss. Big Ben, send us on home strong.
I'm going to be continuing my wrapping up of my favorite films of 2023 in February or whenever it is. And that's another one that's not technically a film, but Letterboxd counts it, so will I. It's Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. My only knowledge of Scott Pilgrim comes from the film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and that's really all the primer I needed to enjoy this newer series, as it heavily references that film. I will say that during the first episode, though, I was not sold. It seemed like an alternate version of the film, but not nearly as clever or as funny. And if you think similarly to me, to you I say, give that second episode a shot, because the alternate version of the story we know is very clever and entertaining, giving all these side characters we only see briefly in the movie time to shine and to explore the depth and nature of Ramona's relationship with all of them. Any problems you had in the original film in regard to how Scott Pilgrim had to battle Ramona's baggage is addressed in this show in a very clever way, with all the style you would expect from Scott Pilgrim. Even extreme side characters get a chance to shine here. Young Neil. I never would have gone into this thing expecting young Neil, the character who just talks about what his favorite Game Boy game is in the movie, to be my favorite character in this show, but he absolutely is. So if you're familiar with the movie, or even if you're not,
100%.
he is. So if you're familiar with the movie, or even not, let Scott Pilgrim win you over.
I was not expecting a murder mystery, but that's exactly what happens, and it's delightful.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much, but yeah, it's clever.
So what, 8 episodes? Something like that?
Yep, 8
hour
episodes,
long?
8 half-hour episodes.
No, they're
half
30
hour.
minutes.
Okay. I'd have to see the movie first, which I haven't seen.
No, you
it's
don't.
Insanely
can watch
I don't think you have to.
Independent.
I do think it would enhance your. I think it would enhance your appreciation.
I'd like to
for it
see the
if you did.
contrast. I'd only be interested for the contrast. Is this a movie you've seen, Andy? Andy, did the Sin Assassins get you, Andy?
I've seen
No.
it. I'm just thinking back. I know I've seen it. I'm trying to piece it together in my head because it's a very vague memory. It was ages ago. This one flew under my radar. I knew it was coming out, but I sort of just ignored it. But maybe I'll go and check it out now. And I'm sure you do have to see the movie first. Just like if you're going to watch Germany Year Zero, you have to see the whole trilogy. Otherwise, why are you even here?
Oh no.
Well, you got to watch the whole war, really. If you don't watch all of World War II, you're going to be lost. You know?
We'll have Jeremy Black just explain it to us real quick.
That'd be excellent. There's got to be some version of this podcast where I'll sit cross-legged listening to Jeremy Black talk about history. But with that, we are all out of show. But we want to thank our guest Andy Slack for joining us. Thank you so much, Andy.
Many thanks. My pleasure.
A Cinemania socialite?
I'd like to think so. The others might
Okay.
disagree.
But we look forward to having you back as well to defend anything you promised. Battlefield Earth, here we come.
Oh, no.
And we hope everyone else will join us again as well as the Reels of Justice keep turning.
Count it.
Robot Sister.
Please follow us on Twitter at Reels of Justice, Instagram Reels of Justice, and Facebook.com/Reels of Justice.